my pleasure to introduce a distinguished public servant and diplomat, the Honorable Timothy Lenderking, the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen. With an extraordinary career spanning decades in the U.S. Foreign Service, he has played a pivotal role in shaping U.S. policy in the Middle East. He has held critical positions, including Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs. His experience extends across some of the most challenging diplomatic landscapes, from serving in Iraq and Pakistan to his current efforts in Yemen. Mr. Lenderking is one of the U.S.'s most experienced diplomats, especially when it comes to the Gulf. As the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, he has been at the forefront of negotiating peace and addressing the humanitarian crisis ongoing, which, even before the war, was breathtaking in the scale of suffering. He played a pivotal role in securing a 2022 truce between the internationally recognized government in Aden and the Houthis, and has worked tirelessly to bring a lasting peace to all Yemenis. As Yemen enters a new difficult chapter, there are few diplomats better suited to lead the U.S.'s effort than Mr. Lenderking. Mr. Lenderking's deep expertise is complemented by his dedication to advancing U.S. diplomacy and fostering stability in one of the world's most complex regions. He's also a patron of the arts. I'm proud to say we met at the exhibit of Saudi Arabia pre-Islamic architecture at the Freer-Sackler Gallery, and I knew then that this was a man in who our country's interests are in safe hands. Please allow me in welcoming Tim Lenderking to our Fireside Chat.
It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Tim Lenderking as a seasoned diplomat. I know he's very popular in the Gulf with the people of the region, which really makes him stand out as an American diplomat. And so we're very pleased to have you today. Our discussion today will be discussing the situation in Yemen from several different perspectives. We'll be looking at the implications of the Gaza war, peace building in Yemen, the GCC's role in Yemen, and maritime security. And the most important issue we'll be addressing is the humanitarian issue in Yemen, which is incredibly important. And to give you a little bit of background, so in President Biden's first main foreign policy speech, he stated that he is going to be stepping up his diplomacy to end the war in Yemen. And I mean, that was actually something that's great. And under their administration, they did actually have the truce, which really endured all of what's going on thus far, which is impressive. But after October 7th and the outbreak of the Gaza war, this really escalated regional tensions. The Houthis declared war against Israel, and things just completely changed. Yemen really has been plagued with many challenges prior to this, with the turning point starting in 2014 when the Houthis took over and seized control of the government, plunging the country into a deep divide. And despite all the efforts, the concerted efforts by the United Nations, the US, and the internationally recognized government, these attempts have really fallen short. In a bold escalation, the Houthis have aligned themselves with the broader axis of resistance, targeting Israeli interests in the Red Sea and Israel itself. And as it stands, there's no peaceful revolution in Yemen. The conflict is stalling and has become yet another frozen conflict. So we're very happy to have you with us, Timothy, and looking forward to hearing your perspectives. My first question for you is probably related to the elephant in the room. People across the Arab world are really searching for agency and dignity after witnessing the horrors in Gaza. And the Houthis are exploiting that void. While it's clear the Houthis are acting in bad faith, using the Palestinian cause to further their own political agenda, they are still seen as heroes by a large part of the population in the region, particularly those who haven't really faced the Houthis' violence directly. So why is the Biden administration treating the Houthi attacks separate from the Gaza war? Why isn't the US addressing the deeper underlying issues driving this support instead of compartmentalizing these crises?
Dania, thank you very much for having me today and for all that the Gulf International Forum is doing to foster understanding, communication. I see so many friends and experts out here with different perspectives. I'm really honored to be with all of you today. I think that's a very good starting point. I'm glad, and David DeRoche, thank you so much for your kind introduction and for also mentioning the fact that there is a truce in Yemen. Some may disparage it, but I think it's a very significant achievement that since April 2022, when the truce was declared, with a strong level of support from many of the countries that I see here, but also from the United States, that essentially that has diminished significantly the fighting inside Yemen. And let's recall that, as you mentioned, there is an acute humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Everybody's forgotten about it. I mean, a couple of years ago, we had many donors turning up to donor events in Geneva and other locales and being generous about putting funding on the table for the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. But that's been eclipsed by Ukraine, now by Gaza, of course, by Sudan and other crises. Those are all deserving. But I think donors feel that there's only so much they can do. I see it as my job, I think, crucially, and that of my team, keep Yemen on the radar screen. It's very easy for Yemen to get lost in sort of the cascade of crisis that we're seeing around the region, first in those other crises. But exactly, I think what you have said, Dania, is something that we tried to do, was to try to keep Yemen sequestered, safe, as a separate conflict, not entangled in the rest of the Middle East's problems. And look, I'll be honest, that's really not possible to do. All of these conflicts and crises are interrelated. What's happening with Hezbollah, what's happening in Lebanon with Hamas, possibly the dramatic news this morning, all of these things will be felt in Yemen and reacted to by Yemenis. So, and you know, there's acute pain across the region in terms of the amount of civilian destruction, the unacceptably high death tolls in each of these conflicts, and certainly many, probably hundreds of thousands of Yemenis have died over the years of this conflict. Helping to bring the violence down is a major accomplishment. And the fact that the violence in Yemen has not resumed, apart from some scattered attacks, and we watch that space very closely, the death toll in Yemen is not increasing in the way that it has in other crises. And I think that's a foundation for what we need to do when there is de-escalation, not if, but when there is de-escalation in the rest of the region. We must use that to help drive the Yemen conflict, forward to a better place. And again, this is not something that the U.S. can do alone. Countries like Oman, Saudi Arabia are vitally important and may come at it with different perspectives. But that's why you see me in those countries more than any other country, because they are key players. And I'll just make another comment about what the Houthis are doing, because I think this is extremely problematic. And I think the way that you framed it is correct, that the Houthis are using the Gaza conflict. And I'm not saying that anybody, it's not on me to say whether anybody in the Middle East feels genuine about the Palestinians or uses the cause, but I think we see this group using it for their own agenda, and that they don't have the interests of the Yemeni people in mind. We see them focusing on military parades, not on passing out food, and those military parades are extremely expensive. And we see them pushing people to go out and demonstrate, not because they feel free to demonstrate in Houthi-controlled areas, but because they are directed to do so. Missing from this picture are photos or footage of Yemenis actually doing things to help the Yemeni people. And so I think we have to understand, we have to be able to separate our passion, our pain, our fury for what's happening in other parts of the world. That doesn't mean we need to endorse what the Houthis are doing.
Yes, I mean, you make some very good points. I think the concern is just dealing with one particular issue and not looking at the holistic situation in the region. I don't think following the Middle East would be the best approach. But you make very good points, and the fact that the Biden administration was able to sustain a truce under all of this is a win for the administration's diplomacy. Aside from everything else that's been going on, that wasn't very favorable. But let's go on to another question. In April, various factions met in Aden to advance a Yemeni dialogue, what became known as the National Political Alliance. And with the truces still holding, is there a plan to include the Houthis in future talks? Additionally, is there a concrete peace plan in place? And what step is the U.S. taking to support and advance this process?
Well, I do think much as people want to suggest that you can wave the Houthis away, they are a factor in Yemen. They are the strongest entity on the ground. They control territory that includes 80% of the population of Yemen, 20 million people. They use that to recruit, to put pressure. What they don't do is govern. They don't have the skill set. They're not experienced in that, and I don't particularly see them, reaching out to govern better. I think they're good at oppression. I think they're good at intimidation. I think they're good at ruling by force. If anything, what we see in Houthi-controlled areas are more repressive measures, more repression of women, more repression of humanitarian workers. I mean, just since June alone, the Houthis have rounded up more than 100 of their countrymen who work for the UN, who work for NGOs, who work for some embassies. They're not spies, but they've been paraded around in a shameless fashion in front of cameras and told that these are members of aspiring. And just as there's misinformation and disinformation in this country, there is disinformation and misinformation in Yemen, and some Yemenis will believe that. It's very easy to grab a hold of a conspiracy theory like that. And in this current, very highly charged environment, some people will say that those NGO staff and Yemeni staff must be punished. But it's really a power move by the Houthis. And again, it's part of this whole context in which they are trying to demonstrate that they are the strongest entity in Yemen. I mean, I do think, again, I don't like the behavior. I think it's, and many Yemenis don't either. I think if there were an election tomorrow in Yemen, the Houthis would not win that election. They are not there by popular force, but nor can one pretend that they don't exist. I think gone are any of the hubristic notions that may have existed at the time this war broke out, that the Houthis can be pushed out of Yemen. I think very likely not. But that doesn't mean that we have to condone or accept what they're doing, and we do need more regional voices to amplify and call out, a lot of the Houthi misbehavior. I mean, if you look at the impediments that the Houthis have placed on international commerce, and we're not talking about Amazon packages here, folks. We're talking about food, fuel, and medicine for the Yemeni people, for the Palestinians, for the Sudanese, and these indiscriminate attacks that the Houthis have launched on Red Sea shipping, killing mariners who have nothing to do with Israel, setting ships on fire, sinking ships, leaving trails of oil, sinking a vessel full of toxic chemicals. This is vital habitat for Yemeni fisher people who depend on fishing as a livelihood for this country. So again, We have to push through the propaganda, the misinformation. What the Houthis are doing is hurting Yemenis. It's hurting the people of Yemen. It's not bringing a morsel of bread to the Palestinians who need all kinds of help. Yes, they do. And we should all, rally around that urgent need. But again, sift through what's being fed into the media and make that distinction. My hope is that we can get the Houthis refocused on a peace process. There is a roadmap. The Houthis and the Yemen government agreed to it in December. The UN envoy, who's here in town today, having high-level meetings, helped broker that arrangement. That's on the shelf at the moment, because how can the international community rally around the notion that one of the key conflict parties in Yemen is attacking the international community by these attacks on the Red Sea, by attacks on civilians, by rounding up Yemeni citizens? It doesn't compute. So we need to get. So I think the Houthis have chosen an aggressive regional path rather than keeping the focus on building on the truce, promoting peace in Yemen. And we want to get back to that.
So how is the U.S. working with key regional players, particularly Muscat, Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi, to facilitate a Yemeni dialogue aimed at achieving a political resolution to the conflict and preserving Yemen's unity and sovereignty? And where are the areas you think that the U.S. policy differs from the Gulf states?
We cannot do this effort in Yemen without international support. And there isn't a single Gulf country, GCC country, that doesn't want to see peace in Yemen. Even the Iranians welcomed the truce in Yemen back when that took place. And there's a lot of diplomacy that's going on with the Iranians with regard to Yemen. So I don't think their role can be discounted. We need the Iranians to show good faith. If they want to follow through on some of the nice things that they talk about wanting to rejoin the international community, Yemen is an ideal place. There isn't a Hezbollah in Yemen yet. Some Yemenis would disagree with that. There isn't a Hamas, but there is a card-carrying member of the Axis of Resistance, the Houthis, who do exist in Yemen. And there needs to be, I think, some right-sizing from the outside community. Nobody has interests more at stake than countries that border on Yemen, and that is Oman and Saudi Arabia. Again, the efforts of the Omanis have been welcomed. They very much, they work very closely with us. They very much want to see a Yemen that's at peace. So does Saudi Arabia. The UAE ultimately does not want to see a Hezbollah-like victor in Yemen. The Qataris have done tremendous work in terms of supporting the humanitarian space with very generous contributions over the years. The Kuwaitis have held peace talks in 2016. The Bahrainis are extremely supportive as well. But the point I want to make, it's much broader than the GCC. Egypt's economy is being pummeled by Red Sea attacks. Their revenues are down more than 50%. They also do not approve of what the Houthis are doing. Let there be a rising level of voices from within the region. Houthis, it's over. There's no more business with, taking out ships on the Red Sea. It's damaging to every single country. It's hurting the Yemeni people. There has to be that kind of pressure. And I think when we get to that moment, we can start to refocus on the peace effort, because ultimately that's what this administration wants. That's what the United States wants, is a durable peace in Yemen. Not to draw a cordon around Yemen and contain and shut the door and have the Yemenis tear themselves apart as long as they're not firing across border. That's not acceptable to this administration. I hope that will be not acceptable to either administration that follows on. We need a genuine peace effort that stabilizes Yemen, makes sure it's not emanating instability into the region, but that gives the Yemeni people, I think, some hope and a stake in their own future. At the end of the day, Yemenis coming together in a Yemeni dialogue is the way to go.
My next question is about maritime security and Russia and China's role in this. Given the growing threats from the Houthis in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, along with reports of China-Houthi agreement to avoid attacks on Chinese vessels, and Russia reportedly supplying the Houthis with anti-ship missiles, what is the U.S. strategy for safeguarding its interests and those of its Gulf allies while countering the rising influence of Russia and China in Yemen, which risks to turn this into a hotspot for great power competition and undermining U.S. interests?
When we look at building coalitions and developing international partnerships to stabilize conflicts, we have been fortunate until recently that the P5, the leading members of the Security Council, US, Russia, France, China, and the UK, we've all worked in unison. We've all rejected the notion that there is a military solution to the Yemeni conflict. We've all supported a political resolution. Russia's peeling off of that consensus. They're talking about arming the Houthis in a way that would menace our ships and international commerce in the Red Sea even more. This cannot go forward. There's a great deal of pressure on the Russians from us, the Saudis, to not go down this dark road. And indeed, that the whole notion that other conflicts should use Yemen as the way to get back at an enemy, not acceptable. That's what the Russians are doing to get back at us, and the coalition in Ukraine is to arm and train the Houthis. That's not going to be acceptable to anybody in the international community. We need the Chinese. We have a very strong dialogue with them on Yemen. They are still part of what I would see as a coalition that agrees there cannot be a military solution, there must be a political solution. But we find it unacceptable that they go to the Houthis and cut their own deal to get their own ships through the Red Sea without being targeted. The Houthis are not the policemen of the Red Sea. They are not a legitimate government in Yemen. They do not have any imprimatur from the international community to take on that responsibility. So countries should not play into that by ceding them that authority, because ultimately the GCC countries in the region are going to vote and pressure for freedom of navigation and away from any militia group from any aspect of the Red Sea trying to take control of vital, waterways. And of course, 70% of international commerce flows through the Red Sea. This is an area of significant interest, not only to the countries in the region, but also the United States, and even more so China. And I think we count on the Chinese here. They don't like this situation. They're frustrated by it. They don't like chaos where there are vital waterways. So I think that conversation needs to be developed, and we need to get the Russians into a more supportive role, because I say they are peeling off to pursue their own agenda with the Houthis. It's damaging to the overall effort and damaging to the Yemeni people.
I would be remiss if I don't ask a question about the humanitarian situation in Yemen. Humanitarian aid, economic desperation, and infrastructure degradation remains a major concern in Yemen, with 18 million people in need of aid and 5 million at the risk of famine. How is the U.S. addressing these shortages and the economic crisis in Houthi-controlled areas, where 80% of the population lives in poverty and lacks critical service? Also, how is the U.S. collaborating with international bodies to ease travel restrictions, facilitate medical evacuation, and restore humanitarian corridors for northern Yemeni civilians to access healthcare and essential services? It's a big question. I know you have to run very soon, but it's an important one.
It sure is. And the United States has been a leader in the humanitarian space in Yemen. We do put our money where our mouth is. We are rivaling with Saudi Arabia as the largest donor to the humanitarian space. So a lot of the food that comes into Yemen for humanitarian purposes through World Food Program, who does a tremendous job, that's food from the American people. And it may not be branded as such, but it's food from the American people. And that's keeping people alive. Again, if you look at what the Houthis could be doing, let that food go forward. Let it reach the people. Don't be grabbing bags of food to feed yourselves, enriching yourselves. Don't make it impossible for female humanitarian workers who have jobs in this space not to be able to go out and monitor and assess projects unless they're accompanied by a male relative. This is not the Taliban. And so having that kind of situation grow up and prevail is unacceptable. The Houthis ride roughshod over humanitarian principles. I've mentioned the imprisonment, the detention of humanitarian workers. They're putting so much pressure on the international space that UN agencies are now in a vigorous conversation about whether they can continue to operate in Yemen at all. And I have to say that as somebody who used to work in the humanitarian space in my 20s, I worked in Afghanistan, and I worked in Pakistan, I worked in Sudan, and I was involved in UN efforts to bring food into central Afghanistan. I know what it's like to ride with those convoys. I know what it's like to have armed groups take the food that you're bringing to the needy people because they have weapons. I've seen it, and I reject it. It's not humanizing. But I think we have to maintain the focus on Yemen so donors think that there's a ray of hope, and I believe there is. That's why the UN envoy is here in this town today to talk to us about how we go forward in this very complicated and chaotic Middle East space with a peace effort for Yemen, building on what we have been able to do so far and ensuring that Yemenis are the beneficiary of our humanitarian support, and that the countries of the region are all joining together to support this effort.
Well, thank you. My alarm went off to let us know that time is up, because I know that Timothy is very busy. He has been back and forth with the White House and the UN envoy, and we truly appreciate you coming today and sharing your perspectives about U.S. policy and posture in Yemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much.